Welcome back to a weekend agenda. Time now for our regular Saturday panel. Today, Simon Breheny from the Institute of Public Affairs and Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute in Canberra. Gentlemen, thank you very much. Good to have you with us in Melbourne and in Canberra. I'm very tempted to ask you about what you think of Winx's stunning victory in the Cox Plate just run, six-length victory, blitzed the field. But no. Let's get on to politics. And first of all, to you, Simon, if I could ask you this. Whatever else emerged from this spat between Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull over guns, one thing it demonstrated yet again, it is not a good idea for the health of your own political party for Prime Ministers to stick around in Parliament once they have been defeated either by a rival or at the polls. It always ends in tears, with the spectacular exception of Sir Robert Menzies, of course.
Yeah, look, I think, Jim, you've hit the nail on the head there. I have to say, I'm a recent convert to that view. I thought at the time that Malcolm Turnbull took the leadership of the Liberal Party that it wasn't too bad an idea for someone like Tony Abbott to stick around. He had a wealth of experience, and I thought that at the time he would be able to share that experience constructively with his colleagues, some of whom were relatively new to the Parliament. I think, unfortunately, we've seen over the last few months, and particularly this week, that hasn't been the case. I think it's very disappointing. And frankly, I think the Labor Party and the Liberal Party have both got fairly significant issues in airing their private disagreements publicly. And I think over guns, we've seen that this week in the Liberal Party. Over pre-selections in Victoria, we've seen that in the Labor Party. And I think that these sorts of disputes being aired out in the public are very bad for the health of both of those parties and for their electoral prospects. But when it comes to Mr Abbott and the Prime Minister, I think it's unfortunate because, to some extent, the legacy of Abbott as Prime Minister is going to be tarnished by the comments that he's making, the issues that he is bringing to bear on the Liberal Party post-Prime Ministership, because for better or worse, that's what's going to be fresh in people's minds. That's what is going to be. That's what Tony Abbott is going to be remembered for. And I think that's a great shame, because there are a lot of good things about Tony Abbott's time as Prime Minister, and I think that to some extent those things are going to be forgotten in light of the recent spats that he's had with the current Prime Minister.
Richard Dennis, one of the things that intrigued me about this and the dynamics of it is that because of where he is coming from, that is Tony Abbott, he can say almost anything he likes about guns, because he knows that the National Party would prefer him as Prime Minister rather than Malcolm Turnbull. Although they don't get a vote in a leadership contest, we know that. But on the other hand, a number, at least on the right of the Liberal Party, would still like that as well. On the other hand, Malcolm Turnbull has to watch out for defections from the right of his party, and what he says or does on guns is very sensitive to the way in which they would behave. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Look, I do, absolutely, and I think that, well, firstly, I agree with Simon before. I think it's becoming increasingly obvious that it's probably in the Liberal Party's interest for Mr Abbott to have moved on, but I don't see that happening soon. And one of the reasons it's not happening is exactly what you just said there, Jim, that basically at the moment Malcolm Turnbull is in a trap of Tony Abbott's making. On the one hand, he's always encouraged to go further and further to the right, whether it's on renewable energy or climate change or now on guns. So he's always being encouraged to hold an olive branch out to the right wing of his party. But as Tony Abbott showed this week, it's a tactic that can't possibly end well for him, because on the one hand he'll be criticised for never going far enough by the right of his party. At the same time, he'll be criticised by a lot of voters, especially I think female voters who usually vote Liberal, watching Malcolm Turnbull say he'd be willing to support rapid-fire shotguns in order to pass industrial relations laws. Electorally, that's disastrous. But then, of course, as you said, Tony Abbott's still free whenever he wants to jump to the centre, safe in the knowledge that the hard right of his party will always prefer him for Turnbull. So, you know, if I were advising Malcolm Turnbull privately, I'd say to him what I'm saying publicly now. He has to manage his party. He has to lead from the centre, because every time he veers to the right, he's either criticised for not going far enough, criticised for going too far, or outmanoeuvred by Tony Abbott. This week all three happened at the same time.
I do want to get to the Labor Party ructions in Victoria in a moment, but I do agree with you, Simon. I think it is a great waste that you have someone who has had 20 years plus experience in the Parliament in serious senior ministerial positions, that there is not a way in which this can be managed. Unfortunately, the facts of life suggest it cannot. Much has been made in recent weeks of people saying, oh, this is being Tony Abbott's taking something out of the Kevin Rudd playbook. I'm reminded of something that happened in October 1991, which was when Paul Keating, between the first and second challenges, as a backbencher, spoke to the National Press Club. He went after Bob Hawke on the issue of new federalism, that is, handing some financial autonomy back to the states and some taxing powers as well. I don't think, from memory, that he mentioned Bob Hawke in that speech at all. The surrogate in there was Michael Keating, then the head of the Prime Minister's Department, who went after him. But in doing what Tony Abbott did in the Parliament this week, and by tweeting earlier on, that was very, very similar to that. And that, as we know, ended very badly for Bob Hawke. But Simon, now to the Labor Party in Victoria. This is all, it seems to me, as a consequence of Bill Shorten going one step too far. Fair enough that in replacing Stephen Conroy, that the right faction should expect that it gets a replacement. Secondly, that under the affirmative action rules of the Labor Party, that it should be a woman. But a very, very close friend of Bill Shorten's, also with her associations with the Health Services Union, this was opening the way for factional opponents of Bill Shorten's in Victoria, with factional deals that go back to time immemorial, the causes and reasons for which can barely be remembered by current politicians, that this is just, as I said, one step too far on the part of Bill Shorten's part.
Well, it was certainly a controversial choice to back Kimberley Kitching to fill the vacancy made available by Senator Conroy's retirement. But, I mean, look, frankly, I think this goes to the heart of a number of issues within both the Labor Party and some divisions of the Liberal Party, it has to be said, where you've got factional power brokers who have far too much power over pre-selections. These sorts of issues are always going to raise their heads. Now, in the context of the New South Wales division of the Liberal Party, there's a lot of talk about democratisation. Part of the reason for that is to avoid some of the problems that you see the Labor Party in Victoria currently facing, where factional power plays are made behind closed doors by power brokers or by leaders in the context of Bill Shorten's intervention here. And I think that sort of problem, to some extent, will be ameliorated if you move to a more democratic model. So where you give members a say over pre-selections, you don't have this sort of manoeuvring behind the scenes. You have members in an open, transparent, democratic process having their say. And I think that both the Labor Party and the Liberal Party should be moving to that model where that doesn't exist. And I think in Victoria, certainly the Labor Party might want to take a leaf out of the Liberal Party's playbook here in moving to that sort of system. And I think they'd be far better served, better off. And look, you may end up with Kimberley Kitching in an open pre-selection process like that. But the point is that the legitimacy that comes from a democratic model where members of a party have a say over who their members of parliament are, who the representatives of that particular political party are, you get far better outcomes overall. So I think that's the key message to take away here. Rather than having these manoeuvrings behind the scene, it's far better to have a democratic model where all members have a say. Richard,
Democracy sounds all well and good, but it can be with its perils as well. You look at the situation at the leadership level with the UK Labor Party, where the danger for Labor now is that they have put in place a leader who is no more electable than Michael Foot was 2 or 3 decades ago up against Margaret Thatcher in the early 1980s, and that is very much a grassroots operation.
Oh, look, absolutely. I think that democracy is always it's a work in progress, and we've seen in Australia, we've seen around the world that different models of selecting candidates and selecting leaders work well right up until they don't. The Australian Democrats here in Australia, once upon a time, the members elected the leader, and I used to work for one of them, Natasha Stott-Despoja, and it didn't end well when the party room had a different view about who the leader should be than the members did. Of course, we see over in the UK, you've now got a Labor leader who's very strongly supported by the membership of his party, but is very strongly opposed by many of the parliamentarians. And here in Australia now, I think the ALP are doing something really quite interesting, which is a hybrid of the two extreme approaches, where members get half of the say and the caucus gets half of the say. So I think one thing we've learned out of the last couple of 100 years out of democracy is there's no right way to pre-select candidates, there's no right way to pre-select leaders, but good parties are always looking down the track at what's going to be good for getting talent into Parliament, what's going to be good for forming policy that's electable. If parties get that right, then if they're selecting good people and they're putting forward electable policies, the process doesn't matter that much. But when you've got processes where internal politics dominates the need to be electable, that's when parties and countries get into big trouble.
One final subject, and briefly if we can. Richard, I'll stick with you. There's a suggestion which emerged from Erica Betts, old Abbott ally, now on the backbench, suggesting that the government should have gone harder on industrial relations during the election campaign, saying it provided the coalition an unbelievably unique opportunity to run a well-founded campaign, warning our fellow Australians as to the consequences of electing Labor and putting some extra substance on the jobs and growth mantra. But my recollection is that the polling on industrial relations was so difficult for the coalition that that's the very reason they didn't go beyond the ABCC and the registered organisations legislation.
Look, I think that's right. I think that Erica Betts should look at the Tasmanians' performance at the last election. All three Liberal MPs lost their seats down there under he's the senior Tasmanian Liberal, and indeed the pre-selection games that Erica Betts was playing saw Tasmania lose their only minister after he was put at an unelectable position on the Senate ticket. So I think it's a bit cheeky that Erica Betts would be giving the rest of the Liberal Party electoral advice. His, not just publicly but privately, I think his state's performance was pretty abysmal.
And Simon, I'm reminded of John Howard suggesting very frequently that industrial relations reform is constantly a work in progress, at the finish line always keeps receding. But it is the truth of the matter, is it not, that in this election campaign, wanting to advance further industrial relations reform would not have worked for the Liberals. They came very close to losing the election outright, and for very good reason, at least tactically, did not push industrial relations reform any further than they did.
Well, I'm not sure about that. I think Erica Betts is right to say that the coalition should have gone harder during the last federal election campaign, but I'd extend it much further than that. I think the coalition should have been talking about industrial relations before the 2013 election. I think we've had years now of missed opportunities on industrial relations at a time when reform to the industrial relations system in Australia is vital. We've gone back to a very old model, a pre-turn of the century model in industrial relations in this country, and I think adding the sort of flexibility that we have to have to ensure that the 21st century economy works as well as it should for everyone is something that's very important. And look, if government doesn't move on this, then innovation will, technology will, and that's what we're seeing happen at the moment with companies like Uber and Airbnb. These are innovative companies that are providing platforms that, to some extent, Airtasker and Freelancer, all of these companies are providing ways for people to get around what is an incredibly restrictive industrial relations model. The reason that's happening is because policymakers haven't moved fast enough. They're not moving with the times, and they have to infuse that sort of flexibility that people are craving into an industrial relations system if it's going to continue to work into the future.
Simon, nice pivot there. Appreciate your time. Simon Breheny from the Institute of Public Affairs and Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute in Canberra. Thank you very much to both of you this Saturday afternoon. And in a moment, all the sport. Might even discover just how the opening movements and minutes of the rugby union test in Auckland between the Wallabies and the All Blacks are going. I hope the Wallabies have started well. We will see. Back in a moment.